Near the western coast of Canada in British Columbia lies a stretch of highway with a haunting reputation. Countless unsolved murders and disappearances of Indigenous women have given Highway 16 the nickname the Highway of Tears. With 50 years of cases and claims of 40 to 80 victims, with some being as recent as 2023, this highway seems like it is best avoided at all cost. Welcome to the world of the arcane. Welcome everyone to this week's episode of the Arcane Archives podcast. Thank you for taking time out of your day, and I hope you guys are ready because this topic for this week is quite tough to digest. At least it was for me researching it. Before we get into it, I just want to say a quick thank you for all of the support that the podcast has been getting. I feel like I can't say it enough, but once again, thank you for all the support. Make sure to head down to the description to see the link to all of my social media accounts. And if you are on a platform where you're able to comment, please do so. Let me know what you think about the episode. And if you have any more future ideas for podcast episodes, please let me know. I read every single comment, and most likely we'll have an episode on that. With the Highway of Tears, there are a couple warnings I want to give you guys. This episode does talk about murder, abduction, sexual assault, racism, sexism. So if these are things you're sensitive to, just keep that in mind. Now, with that being said, let's talk about Highway 16, also known as the Highway of Tears. So, Highway 16 is located right in the middle of British Columbia. For those of you unfamiliar with Canadian geography, British Columbia, also known as BC, is the province on the west coast above the US states of Washington, Idaho, and a tiny sliver of Montana. This highway is a part of the Yellowhead Highway, which is a major branch of the Trans-Canadian Highway, a system of roads that span the country of Canada from coast to coast. The Yellowhead Highway branches off in the province of Manitoba and continues through other provinces till it reaches the west coast of BC. A section of this highway between the town of Prince George and Prince Rupert is our focus for this episode. In this stretch of road, it spans about 446 miles or 718 kilometers. It was completed and started being used in the year 1970, which coincidentally is the year that all these abductions and murders started. I say coincidentally because there really has been no correlation between the construction and the start of using it and these crimes. So I just threw that in there. The victims that are disproportionately represented in these horrific crimes are those of Indigenous women. You can use terms such as First Nations to describe these people, but for consistency with the episode and with the MMIW group, which we'll talk about later, I am going to continue calling them Indigenous for the episode. Now, a little bit of a history lesson to help understand how we got into this situation. We know that the Indigenous people were treated extremely poorly with the development of countries like Canada and the United States. In the 1700s up to around the 1930s, at least in Canadian history, there were sharp decreases in Indigenous populations due to a couple of things: diseases, killings, things related to that. But thankfully, since the 1930s, the quality of life for the Indigenous people have improved drastically, but it's still important to understand that there was that history of discrimination, which does play into all of this. On top of this history, it's important to know a little more about where exactly in the country this is taking place. The highway is further up within the province, and for anyone that knows about Canadian population, the vast majority of people live very close to the Canada-US border. The further up you go, the less people there are, and the poverty level does increase. This isn't something exclusive to British Columbia or Canada, but it's a general understanding that smaller, more remote places don't have the same level of economic success or even economic opportunity as places such as larger cities or larger towns. With that can also come crime. Drugs, alcohol, domestic violence tend to rise in these conditions. Now, I personally have lived and driven in parts of northern Canada, and if you have too, you know that there's a lot less human interaction. Long stretches of highway from one small town to another does make Highway 16 a great place to commit crime, as there are fewer people to see you commit them. Many of these victims that we will talk about did not have a source of transportation. They relied on what little public transportation there was, or they relied heavily on hitchhiking. I don't feel like I need to say why hitchhiking isn't always the best idea, but then again, this was back in the 70s, the 80s, and it was a more common thing to do back then. So just another important thing to keep into perspective. With all of this condensed history, it helps paint a picture of who, where, what, when, and why these crimes took place. One last thing before we continue, I really wasn't able to find demographic data in this specific area during the 50-year span, so I can't say for certain if these women were being targeted specifically for being indigenous and because they were women, or because they were the majority ethnicity there, that there just so happened to be more of them. Can't really say. Regardless, it seems directed at indigenous women, which obviously is a terrible thing. It's just all this research I'm doing, or I guess that I did, and all the stories and the situations these people were in, it's awful. It's just something you don't ever expect to happen, and then when it does, it just doesn't seem real. The naming of it to the Highway of Tears can be traced back to multiple vigils that were held in honor of those lost and the tears of the family members that mourned them. Now, in school, I remember something in American history called the Trail of Tears. This involved the forced removal and migration of native tribes west, which in turn brought to the death of thousands of natives due to exposure, the targeted killing of them, etc. In the research that I did for this episode, I didn't read of any connections between the Trail of Tears and the Highway of Tears. I feel like there's some sort of connection due to who is involved in the naming of it, but that's my personal belief, so take that with a grain of salt. With all of our little tidbits of history lesson completed, let's start talking about the victims. There are debates on exactly how many victims there are. Some, such as the Canadian officials, estimate it to be around 30 to 40 women, while other people claim it to be closer to 80 plus women. These numbers do involve missing persons and murders both solved and unsolved. When these events started happening, the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Group, the MMIW, became a leading role in the spreading of awareness of these awful attacks. We won't go into too much detail about the MMIW, but just remember they focus on spreading awareness of, as their name states, missing and murdered Indigenous women. If you are interested in what they have to share, please go look at that after the episode, which I will mention at the end. So before we talk about specific victims, let's do a quick recap because I feel like I covered a bunch of topics in only a couple of minutes. We are focused on a remote stretch of highway with little population around. Indigenous women are becoming victims at rates much more than any other group in this area. Sadly, due to historic inequalities, these communities are left in economic struggles, which many resort to hitchhiking. Mix in potential police bias in these earlier cases, sexism as all of these victims are women, and you have yourself a terrible recipe for what is the Highway of Tears. Let's travel back to the 1970s to talk about our first recorded victim, Tracy Clifton. There is no specific day on which she was kidnapped. It was reported that she had been arguing with her mother, and after things got a little heated, she opened the door and she ran away. Being last seen walking down the Highway 16, she simply was never seen again. Just like that. Now, I feel like I have to add this disclaimer, a very, 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 very small possibility that she ran away and she did end up living her life somewhere else, but simply the situations and the future occurrences of this freeway, most likely she was abducted. Sad as it is, it's just, you have to be realistic at the same time. And there are a lot of victims that go missing where you never see them again. And you hope for the best that these people are still alive out there, if they ran away, that they're living a better life. Like I just said, given the situation of this highway, it's more likely the sinister option. I won't spend too much time going through each of the victims because there is a lot of information for each one, and as I've said before, there's at least 30 to 40 people to cover, so we'll point out a couple of things with each of these cases. So our first homicide victim was 14-year-old Monica Ignace. Her body was found in a gravel pit with signs of strangulation. There are witness reports of a car pulled over to the side of the road on the one she was found, and there was a man and a girl in the car the night before. That's it. Some of these, you just have little to no information. Another example, one of the oldest victims was 89-year-old Margaret Newski. She went missing in 2004 while being seen wandering along the highway. She did have dementia, so that for sure plays a factor into this whole disappearance. Some of the youngest victims include a newborn baby who was killed in a deliberate burning of a building, a 4-year-old girl named Amanda Jean Simpson who was beaten to death, and no one was ever charged for that, and 3-year-old Christine Kinniquan who was strangled to death alongside her mother. The most recent victim was Chelsea Amanda Kwa. She went missing in the month of October 2023, and her remains were found the following month. Sometimes it's an open-closed case in a month. Sometimes it's an open case that goes cold for 50 years. Some people are charged. Sometimes no one is ever charged for murder. It's just sadly how some of these things go. There are many more cases that I did not mention, with a wide range of ages, locations, and motives. However, I did mention that some of these murders did actually have a resolution to them. One example is Therese Humphrey. She was found nude and partially frozen after last being seen intoxicated outside of a grocery store. Serial killer Brian Peter Arp was convicted and sentenced to prison for her murder. There are more cases with bittersweet resolutions, but the unsolved sadly do outweigh the closed cases in terms of quantity. There aren't many quote-unquote theories that we can really talk about. The only real consistent thread connecting all of these cases is that they were Indigenous women and that it took place on this section of Highway 16. There isn't concrete evidence for a single killer or evidence for an organized group of killers. There are different methods for the killing and abducting, and since they vary so much, that just adds more questions on who's involved or how many people are involved. Now, there are some theories, such as evil spirits or even aliens. I don't think that aliens have a part to play in this. There was not a single account of an evil spirit or an alien nearby this highway. Like, there was nothing. And so I feel like people are just using the A word, the alien word, just to throw some interest into this case. So until we can find more and more similarity between all these cases, it will most likely be treated as individual cases rather than a mass serial killer or group of killers. There is the belief that both racism and or sexism has a hand to play in all this. Yeah, on the face, this makes a lot of sense because all the victims were female and the vast majority were Indigenous. I do have to add a little asterisk that with serial killers who obviously go out and kill, they typically keep the same MO, the way they kill people or abduct them, and they usually kill people similar to a specific person in their life or similar to their first victim. So because all of these were female and Indigenous doesn't mean that it was strictly racism or sexism. It could just be because the first person murdered fit this description, and so the rest do or are similar to. Many articles state, and something I also believe, is that there were or are active multiple serial killers who take advantage of this highway's location. The potential desperation of those walking along the highway because they have no car, or simply just people in poor living conditions. If you were walking along the side of the road and someone offered to take you to the nearest town, you would agree. It's if you're desperate, you will take desperate measures. And sometimes you end up in a situation like this. So what is being done exactly about this highway? Well, in 2005, the RCMP launched the program ePANA. This is a project to help raise awareness and solve those cases. It has since branched out to more than just this section of Highway 16, and it covers the majority of the British Columbia province. The MMIW is consistently looking for ways to spread awareness and caution. They have done things such as putting up billboards along Highway 16 in hopes to spread words of caution and hope. They have been a champion in improving cell phone coverage of the area to, if necessary, help with future issues. If you want to support them or just learn more about the initiative, go to highwayoftears.org to learn about that. With that being said, thank you everyone for listening to this week's episode. I really feel like we only skimmed the surface of Highway 16. Like I said, there were many, many victims, and it was tough. Just researching and seeing pictures of these girls, seeing what happened to them. It's just awful. It's such a tragedy that this happens. Well, on that happy note, if you made it to the end of the episode, once again, a huge thank you for your support. Again, link down below in the description to all my various platforms. Comment if you want to see anything specific on future topics, or let me know how this episode went. Again, go visit highwayoftears.org to go show them support. Take care, everyone. I will see you next week.